the thing about this question is that when it's first posed to you, it seems incredibly absurd. To ask the question, should UCT make all bathrooms gender neutral, just seems ridiculous, especially based on the status quo. What we as Science Proposition are going to do today is show you how arbitrary and ridiculous it actually is for the status quo to exist, and also why UCT has the mandate in order to make all bathrooms gender neutral in a more general sense. So first of all, I want to just make clear that in terms of implementing this policy, that we're not trying to make a ridiculous statement that this should happen right now, right away, this is how it's got to be, and this is the way it is. We're talking about UCT implementing this sensitively over time, like it would with any complex or important system. And when it actually goes about doing this over time slowly, like we see it's happening now with one bathroom, we would see that it happens with support systems, with discourse is created, support systems like security, like different modes of communication to happen to make sure that people feel safe and comfortable, for workshops to happen, for digital course to be created around it as it progresses through time, right? And the ultimate goal is for all bathrooms to be gender neutral. Now, the reason we think that UCT should do this, and like it's going to be elaborated throughout our speeches, is that the idea that yes, like a university's like mandate is to socialize us all to the status quo, but also to promote this idea of what the future should look like, especially UCT being one of the top universities in the world, right? But beyond this, like this idea of gender neutral bathrooms, like first of all, it's just ridiculous. Like, how many times have people been looking for a bathroom and suddenly all you can find is a male bathroom and you're a female? And then you're forced to be like, do I hold it in or do I just use the fucking male bathroom? Just from like a cisgendered perspective, right? And that's what my speech is going to be showing. Our second speaker, Tato, is going to be talking about the actual trans and queer community in terms of that and how that's applied. I'm going to be talking about how it's arbitrary and ridiculous in a more general cisgendered societal sense, right? So now we also have different things, like we have these conceptions like different kinds of bathrooms. A male bathroom and a female bathroom have different etiquette. Females like conduct themselves differently in a female bathroom, and males conduct themselves differently in a male bathroom. And like as someone who's been exposed with male and female bathrooms and gender neutral bathrooms, I can tell you first and foremost, all bathrooms get fucking grossed. Public bathrooms are just gross spaces where stuff happens. Get used to it. So like, this is also just part of this idea that we just need to start breaking down these weirdly arbitrary ideas we have about what makes a female bathroom and what makes a male bathroom. These spaces are spaces where we go to do things, and for things to happen in a need-based basis, we need to go to the bathroom. Bathrooms will also be implemented in such a way that they are cubicle-based, so we'd have urinals available, toilets available, and handicap spaces available, all in a singular space, so that this idea of segregating these spaces and making them some sort of arbitrary sense that a male goes here, a female goes there, a disabled person goes to a separate disabled bathroom in between, like it's actually just ridiculous, right? So now the reasons for this are like multifaceted. So we have this idea that we want to break down this gender idea of like, you are male, you are female, therefore this and that. But what we also want to say is that we're not trying to get rid of male and female identities. Gender neutral bathrooms are just to point out the fact that bathrooms are not by necessity maled or femaled. It's the idea that you can still be a male or female and identify as such and still take part in a bathroom which is gender neutral, just because it's one of those spaces which isn't necessarily meant to be gender divided. However, it's something that in our everyday lives we don't actually even give a second thought. We're like, yeah, that seems natural, that seems normal, because culturally we have progressed in a way where we do actually like define ourselves differently based on the bathroom we go to and how we act within these bathrooms. We would like to see this change, because it doesn't have to be this way, right? So in terms of like how that operates, we just think that these ideas that we have typically have been formed by the fact that it is the status quo and we have these ideas of the normalization. And the idea is that it doesn't have to be this way, and that gender neutrality in general doesn't have to interfere with people's identities. It doesn't have to actually threaten anyone's identities in the sense of selves, but actually is about promoting the sense that everyone has a space, everyone is included in a single area, and no one is divided or segregated arbitrarily for any one reason or another, but can use a space holistically for what it needs to be used for. And that is what this concept is about. And UCT should be actually making the system happen over time, especially as it starts like spearheading this in terms of what it means to be gender neutral in the world and creating discourses around this, creating discourses around gender, creating discourses around sexism, creating discourses around transphobia, queerphobia, all these issues. And for these many reasons, which I've tried to whirlwindly explain within the first speech, and which will be elaborated in great detail by my second and third speaker, we really truly believe that UCT should make all bathrooms gender neutral.
What I'm not going to deny about Amber's speech, and what I'm not going to deny about the proposition's case, is that the gender binary is arbitrary. That the gender binary is silly, right? I think we can all agree on that today. I think we can all agree that just because you're born with a certain set of genitalia, society shepherding you into a certain way of behaving is a problematic concept. I think we can all agree with that. But what the proposition side fails to analyze is that this gendered way of thinking is something that's deeply ingrained in our society. And although it is harmful on some levels, it's something that a lot of people within our society hold very dear to them. And a lot of people in our society, upon being forced quite radically, even though they have a long-term initiation policy, to somehow force off these ideas that are very, very deeply entrenched in their psyche, is something that's very harmful psychologically and otherwise to these people. And that's what we're going to be showing you in our case today. We'll be showing you that although these people are subscribing to a problematic construct within society, their rights are important as well. Moreover, we'll be showing you that by only implementing some gender-neutral bathrooms, we create a system where gender-neutral bathrooms are the most safe spaces they can possibly be. So we're not only protecting those people who ascribe to the gender binary, we're protecting everyone, trans people, members of the queer community, or even people who are cisgendered and just don't like the idea of going to a gendered bathroom. We'll be showing you how we protect the most people within society. But a few points of rebuttal first. Amber told you that the point of and the goal of a university is to sort of progress society and move us forward. What we'd say is, yes, that's true, but we think a more primary mandate of a university is to create a space that is safe for the students in it, where they don't feel uncomfortable, and we think that isn't something that's being happened. Secondly, as far as discourse being created is concerned, we don't think she's shown us how simply implementing some gender-neutral bathrooms doesn't create the discourse value. I think us having this debate when only implementing some gender-neutral bathrooms is testament to the fact that this discourse happens anyway. Finally, I'm going to deal with, and this is going to sort of streamline into my substantive matter, the idea of just how arbitrary this binary is. So we think, yes, it is arbitrary, but to some people, it's very important. And saying the status quo is silly is accurate, but saying we can simply shrug it off very quickly is something that simply doesn't engage with reality. So I'm going to talk to you about identity and how this kind of leads into exclusion through talking about kind of three actors, right? I'm going to talk about trans people, like femme gay people who sometimes are abused in gendered bathrooms, and rape victims who necessarily feel comfortable going to bathrooms that aren't gendered because they feel like it's a place they can escape someone who's very problematic to them, and who, as we've seen based on social media interaction that's become quite prevalent lately, is often a person who is still on campus. So we think all three of these individuals are like actor groups that feel like they need to use a certain type of bathroom. We think this may be a gendered bathroom in the case of people who are necessarily rape victims, or in the case of other individuals who just don't feel comfortable using gender-neutral bathrooms, and we think it may be a gender-neutral bathroom in the case of like trans people and necessarily femme gay people. And we think that this is important to them on two levels. Firstly, and this is the first level I'm going to be talking about, the idea that it's just a gender-neutral space or a gendered space is something that appeals to them and their specific needs. And what we think is important here is that this can only be fulfilled if we have a variety, if we have both gendered bathrooms and gender-neutral bathrooms. Because the second we create only gender-neutral bathrooms, we're lumping all these individuals together in a single space. And that's problematic, because the reason these individuals like to use a certain type of bathroom is because it's a place they can escape from individuals in society they don't want to be using the same bathroom as. So by offering simply no assurance that there's going to not be this individual you don't want in your bathroom, that's problematic for all these individuals. So what we think we need to do is create a variety, right? A system where they can use either gendered bathrooms or gender-neutral bathrooms based on their preference. What we think creating just gender-neutral bathrooms does is very problematic, and it stops these people. On a second level of identity, however, we'd argue that they're people to whom religion and culture is vitally important. We think many people within the Muslim faith who are women simply don't feel comfortable using a gender-neutral bathroom because of their culture, because of the sort of systems that imposes upon them, and because of the sort of way that dictates their life, and something that's very important to them. We think it's not going to be something that proposition can do to tell us that these people simply can just shrug off their religion and things that are quite central and important to them within their religion or within their culture. Finally, I'm going to be talking about just how we remove the ability for these gender-neutral bathrooms to act as a safe space. And this is the second level of importance that we think offering variety suggests, right? Because we think that these gender-neutral bathrooms, specifically for individuals who like to use gender-neutral bathrooms and not gendered bathrooms, are important not only because they're a non-gendered space, but because they're a space these people know their oppressor will never think of using. We don't think someone who's transphobic is ever going to use a gender-neutral bathroom, and we think that by allowing all bathrooms to be gender neutral, we're forcing these oppressors into these spaces and creating a system where these spaces are no longer safe anymore, removing the value of gender neutral bathrooms. For these reasons, and the reasons which my second and third speaker will talk about, we simply think it is impractical and highly problematic to make all bathrooms at UCT gender neutral. We like to uphold the most people's dignity, the most people's feeling of being comfortable and not being excluded. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much to the first speakers from both sides. I'd now like to open the floor for questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand. Yeah, I'm willing to talk. Okay, so there's 5 questions being offered. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, I'll work this way around. So, firstly.
From the first speaker from the proposition side. Yes, UCT is one of the top universities in Africa and the world, whatever. Let's not forget that UCT is in Africa, it's in South Africa. Majority of the country is still faced with cultural bases and cultural norms and traditions. So if we all of a sudden, for example, I'm a student from the Eastern Cape, where it is known that the man is the head of the house, for example. So if now I use the same bathroom or toilet that my own dad uses in my what I've lived growing up. So in that case, how would we be able to try and convince most people to adapt to their cultures?
Okay, thank you. Next person.
This is for the opposition. So the concept that I'm just trying to ask about is, with a slow increase of gendered bathrooms, you may have a problem in that trans individuals who are, as they call it, stealth, and who don't obviously want to be outed, might fear that they would be outed by opting to use these gender-neutral bathrooms. And I guess the question is, how exactly would you deal with that? If everyone has to use gender-neutral bathrooms, then obviously there's no way to single out people who are using them and for further investigation or whatever the transphobic community might do.
So I think it's interesting. Essentially what we're trying to do with this motion is weigh up the needs of, I think what we can all agree is a minority versus a majority, and how do we equally balance the two and make both feel as though they're comfortable in this space. And I think it's interesting when we're looking specifically at bathrooms that we analyze what it means essentially to go to a bathroom. I think for many people, particularly like cis hetero people, they feel as though when you go to a bathroom, you're essentially, I guess, getting naked, okay? And to some extent revealing yourself, and it's a sense of vulnerability which I think they aren't comfortable with exposing to members of the other gender. And so I think what needs to be considered is exactly what it means to go to a bathroom and how this affects the views of a majority.
Okay, next person.
So my question is to the opposition. So like you outlined like 3 central things that you think are important to, like, that people have ingrained feelings, that they are made to feel uncomfortable, and that they would like to escape some individuals. Like when there was racial segregation in bathrooms, all of those 3 things were still true, right? That people were uncomfortable and that some individuals would like to escape some other individuals. We don't think it was okay to racially segregate bathrooms simply because some people feel uncomfortable when people were made to feel comfortable by having it forced upon them, then society changed. We think that that's the valuable way to go. Why is your situation any different?
Okay, thanks. Okay, yeah, sure.
I just wanted to ask what Speaker 1 mentioned if they did make all the bathrooms gender neutral at the university, put measures in place to ensure that it ran smoothly. And one of the measures that you mentioned was security. And I feel like if you need to be implementing something like security, then obviously you're saying that there's something unsafe with the gender neutral bathroom. So how do you rebut that?
So I think my point touches on Jade's point, but it's similar things. So again, this is for the opposition. I think there tends to be a thing of like going against people's religions or cultures. If those cultures perpetuate negative ideals, so a lot of people had a culture of apartheid or of racism. Like if we make people feel uncomfortable in a way in which we're like taking away the perpetuation of negative ideals, like why is this any different with gender? So like why is it like okay for people to have like sexism within religion, but then suddenly when they've got racism within culture, that's problematic? Or like so like why do we have the exception in this case?
Okay, thank you to the floor, and I'd now like to ask both of the speakers to return to the floor to reply to these questions. Just as a point of clarity, I'll be banging when you have, banging once when you have 1 minute left, and then banging twice when your time is supposed to be up. Okay, so first speaker with the proposition.
Okay, cool. Well, great questions, everyone. Like, this is really cool. I'm just going to dive right in just to make sure I adequately address everyone's concerns, right? So I think this first concern brought up about cultures, right, is very important. And this idea that we can't just like try and position ourselves in this little bubble of UCT where we're all privileged and life is great and we're all in this like liberal Western democracy existence. Like, I agree. And I definitely think that's not how we're trying to position ourselves, right? And what I would think, like ideally in a world where we're trying to implement this idea that UCT should implement this, I would imagine that it would need to be in close dialogue with people who have these cultural concerns. And that would mean maybe entail coming to certain compromises in terms of what bathrooms mean or should include, or how they can approach it and make people more comfortable with it. Whether that should be through workshops or changing their model slightly in order to cater for these people, right? I think it should definitely be part of how it's implemented. Because I think these things are valuable, right? And speaking to Iona's kind of point of whether these things can be damaging to society, then maybe we should just get rid of them. My point is that I think that, like, in terms of cultures and African cultures, in terms of respect and how genders are divided in terms of respect, like, I actually think that that is, like, perfectly legitimate in its different forms, right? I think it actually can manifest in non-legitimate and harmful ways. But I think fundamentally it doesn't have to be illegitimate, and I think to kind of claim that would be harmful, right, against those cultures, because it's incredibly important. And I think that the idea is that we want to actually create these bathroom spaces and show how creating a gender-neutral space doesn't threaten those cultural hierarchies. And I think that that can be done through the way that UCT approaches it, right? So I hope that adequately deals with your question. Moving on to this idea of the minority versus the majority, as Marcus identifies. Like, I think this is an important issue to identify in this debate. And the idea that you're suddenly trying to cater to a minority by making a gender-neutral bathroom, therefore having one gender-neutral bathroom is great, minority is happy, majority is happy, they still have their separation and they don't feel as vulnerable. And by making all bathrooms gender-neutral, we're creating a vulnerability and stuff in a majority. What we would say to this is that we want to actually work against this over time to the point that they no longer feel vulnerable in those spaces, because we believe those vulnerabilities are generated by ideas which are necessarily imagined and perhaps not necessarily legitimate, especially if we're creating separate spaces in terms of cubicles, allowing for all kind of facilities to be available in terms of urinals or whatever shit people might need, and so on. So finally, in terms of security and saying that this needs to be provided and therefore conceding that that would be an issue. When I say that, I'm not conceding that it necessarily will be an issue, but I think it's important to admit that it's a possibility that it could be, right? And I think that in terms of talking about those sort of issues, those need to be addressed in how we approach it, in terms of how people feel safe, in terms of how people harass people, like, for example, trying to avoid their perpetrator. Like, I don't think necessarily gender-neutral bathrooms perpetuates this, because I think that those kind of, like, avoiding your perpetrator can happen in a lecture theatre. It can happen in a classroom, an empty classroom. It can happen walking down a corridor. And we don't think bathrooms should necessarily be the spaces where this issue is centered around, but we think security still potentially is something that needs to be explored in a more general sense as the project goes forward. And that's not necessarily a concession, but an acknowledgement as we move forward. Thanks.
So I've streamlined the questions into 3 responses that I think are important. Firstly, the idea of like stealth transsexuals, for lack of a better word. Secondly, the idea of how this is different from racial segregation. And thirdly, the idea of how some cultures are like negative and enforce problematic things. We should like force people out of those cultures. So firstly, under this idea David brought up of like stealth transsexuals who don't want to out themselves, we think this is why gender neutral bathrooms not being every single bathroom is vitally important. I think what that fails to analyze is that not only trans people use gender-neutral bathrooms, to the extent that we think a trans person deciding to use a gender-neutral bathroom when there are only some of them isn't outing themselves. We think there are lots of people who just don't like the gender binary but are cisgendered. People who, because of practicality, because it's the nearest bathroom, would choose to use this gender-neutral bathroom, or like even hipsters who just think because of their identity they like to use gender-neutral bathrooms. So we don't think it's outing yourself. Secondly, why this is different from racial segregation, we think for two levels. Firstly, because as Marcus highlighted, like gender is linked to how people use bathrooms in a way that's far less arbitrary to like race being linked to how people use bathrooms. I think you put it well when you said that some people perceive this as like a place you get naked. And the fact of the matter is that because people of the same gender share the same funky bits, like lots of people feel more comfortable getting naked in a space that people who have the same like genitalia are in, right? We think that's important, and we think that's far less arbitrary than not wanting to use a bathroom with someone else simply because they don't have the same skin color as you. That's something that's quite important. We think that racially segregating bathrooms makes absolutely no sense, but gender does for these reasons. However, that being said, we still respect the right for some people to like segregate themselves based on gender, or if like conversely they don't want to use a gender neutral bathroom. We think that it's like something you can decide to do, so whether you feel comfortable or not. But secondly, we think that like having it's different because we think that racially segregating bathrooms is like a direct affront to people who are like the racial minority being segregated against rights. We think in this instance we can actually uphold the rights of trans people even better if we have only some gender neutral bathrooms. The idea of like allowing them to use a space they're safe in, creating a place that's still safe, that analysis.
I'd now like to open the second portion of the debate and ask the second speaker of the proposition to continue their case.
Firstly, I'd like to start by saying that the opposition's case is a bit paradoxical, don't you think? They're arguing for inclusion from an exclusion point, from an exclusion basis, because essentially what they're saying is that their case is excluding a significant number of people that are present on campus. So it shouldn't only be about the inclusion of catering for the needs for specific gender roles, but for other people that also are part of our student bases. And a case for those people is what I'll be doing in my speech. So to analyze to conduct a fair cost-benefit analysis on having these bathrooms or segregated bathrooms, as I'm going to call them, we need to look at the psychological impact that they have on some of the student population. As a transgender person, when confronted with when confronted with segregated toilets, it sort of manifests itself as a negative social impact because the decision of which toilet to use, it requires a certain level of self-acceptance. So if you understand what transgender means, it means you're moving from one gender role to another. So the ultimate form of acceptance is for you to know that, okay, although I was born a female, I definitely do belong in the male's toilet. And I don't think it's fair to ask an 18 or 19-year-old to make such a decision, especially considering the role that an education institution such as UCT occupies in today's society. So we can extend this argument beyond transgender people. We can include intersex people or even people that don't even identify with any gender role. And that's where you start to see that the moral basis for segregated bathrooms starts to disintegrate very quickly. So for UCT to be a fair institution like it says it is, it needs to create bathrooms that cater to everyone on campus, meaning that there should be bathrooms for heterosexual females and males, there should be bathrooms for lesbians, gays, bisexuals, transgender people and intersex people, because you can't define sexuality in a binary form like opposition is trying to do. But then as soon as you start to realize this obvious solution, we have to know that it is quite impractical, and this is where I believe the case for unisex toilets starts to develop. We need to be very careful of how we approach such issues in the modern society, because we live in a very globalized world, so meaning that we all come from different backgrounds, and as soon as we try to construct solutions that cater for specific groups of people, there's room for exclusion because we can't really capture everyone. People are different. So within a globalized world, we need to come up with solutions that accommodate everyone, and not solutions that systematically exclude the minority. Because in an ideal world, we will try to include everyone. Segregation will always be a telling sign of a morally inconsistent society, and we can see this as far back as apartheid. Because once you start differentiating between males and females, then you allow for issues such as women abuse or even gender issues, where literally it boils down to what's in between your pants. That's how you differentiate between how you treat somebody. So we definitely need these people to be interacting with one another if that's something which is important to society in general. And I'd like to challenge the first speaker from opposition in terms of the role that a university is supposed to play. Education has been reduced to a system which socializes students into a predetermined world, meaning it teaches us how to act and how to think in the status quo. This explains a lot of things that have been going around campus. It explains the uproar due to the addition of one unisex toilet on campus. Why? Because that is all that people know, and because that is all that people know, and they're thus not willing to expose themselves to different things. And I'd like to propose that the purpose of education should be to socialize students to be dreamers and builders of a world that doesn't exist. Hopefully a world that is much more inclusive and equal than currently is. And in terms of me sounding like I'm describing a utopia, I'd like to suggest empirical evidence to unisex toilet by saying that we can see through the very imposing signs outside disabled toilets. These signs say that this toilet is for disabled people only. While UCT does not recognize the fact that disabled toilets are the only gender-neutral toilets on campus. Disabled toilets are the only toilets where you can walk in and you don't feel the need to be a male or a female. You can be a female who's not really into how they look. So you don't feel the pressure of having to look in the mirror after you use the toilet. So I'd like to remind everyone that the purpose of an institution is to build future leaders. And as future leaders, it is our responsibility to create a world that if your child was transgendered, your child would live a happy life, of which that's something that's definitely not attainable if we're gonna keep dividing toilets between males and females. Thank you.
So I think from hearing the second speaker of the proposition tonight, what we really, as the opposition, need to hear is a case of an individual who is faced with a choice between choosing a gender bathroom or a gender-neutral bathroom and still feels as though they are excluded. And we don't feel that such case can reasonably exist. We feel that when you allow for people to choose to identify or to reject the constructs of binary gender roles, you allow for people to express themselves in whatever way they actually feel, right? And as is stated by our first speaker, is that people can use gender-neutral bathrooms for a variety of reasons. So it's not necessarily forcing you to choose, it's not necessarily outing yourself. And in that way, we think we accommodate the best number of people in a way that best protects the most vulnerable members of our society, the most vulnerable members who happen to be women who are trans, men who are trans, homosexual people who are categorized as femme and are constantly treated as inferior, constantly subject to harassment, women who don't feel comfortable using bathrooms with men purely because it's difficult to navigate the world as a woman, even just walking down the street without being catcalled and harassed and violently harassed verbally. So in that case, we think that in our side of the house, we've definitely been able to show thus far why it is particularly valuable for this choice to exist if it means we're going to be protecting the most number of people. So today I'll be dealing with the idea of pushing moderates who tolerate transgender people towards actively disliking and actively rejecting them, and how that is problematic for the way in which we would like to deal and for the way in which we would like society to develop to accept people of different genders. So if we consider who these people are, they're people we have classes with, people we have reses with, people we share friends with. These are the jocks. These are the people who really value their gender identity. hyper-masculine or hyper-feminine individuals, people who, as the proposition has claimed and acknowledged the existence of, people who have transphobia, right? But because it doesn't directly affect them, would accept the idea that there is a gender-neutral bathroom. But the problem is that once something is imposed upon someone who doesn't feel as though it ought to be, the reaction and how they behave towards transgender people and the people who these bathrooms are meant to be servicing changes. You begin to then blame those gender neutral or trans people who are targeted as the people who these bathrooms are meant to be benefiting as the main cause of this discomfort, right? So what will happen then is that it will lead to a discomfort, it will lead to a place where people who want these bathrooms feel comfortable using bathrooms because they have a whole lot of bathrooms to choose from, but in every other sphere of campus life, that's when it will become harder for them to navigate because they will be targeted as the people whom we blame for having to be forced into this position, right? But also I think what the proposition fails to engage us on is the idea that we can intellectualize gender, right? We can make gender moral and really come to the conclusion that it doesn't exist in a philosophical and abstract sense. But that isn't in touch with the ground. That isn't in touch with the fact that it manifests itself, regardless of whether or not it ought to, in the way that people interact. And we feel that it doesn't actually address the problem of hostility towards people who don't fit into these binary roles. In fact, we think it works backwards. If you really want people to start accepting transgender people, homosexual people, people who are cisgendered, what you do is change the way that they think. You talk to them, you educate them, you make sure that people feel comfortable with this idea that gender is in fact a construct. What you do when you sidestep that entire important issue in terms of developing as an individual and developing as like a liberal individual who understands the rights of people, you make it easier for people to become more radical, to radicalize against a really legitimate group of people who deserve to have a voice. What we offer is the opportunity to represent both transgender people or people who want to use gender-neutral bathrooms, as well as those who don't. But also, we think that this motion really doesn't deal with the fact that a gendered reality is one that isn't confronted, right? The idea that there are power imbalances between men and women and heterosexual and hyper-masculine men and the rest of society, that would mean that it's difficult for you or I to potentially, as females or as people who don't identify as being masculine, to share a space with them, right? Like, if you are a female and you already face harassment in the public world, you already are denigrated and degraded publicly all the time, it is difficult to then share a space where you are not safe in the most vulnerable and enclosed space you can possibly be. And that's problematic. And that's something that they don't really deal with. And we'd urge them to engage upon this because if you really consider our politics, what we are addressing is the most number of people and the most number of considerations, both culturally, socially, and religiously. And for those reasons, we are proud to oppose.
Okay, 5 questions. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Go ahead.
Yeah, I've already spoken to that proposition. Okay, so you said that your goal with the bathrooms is to eliminate any differences between men and women that you feel equal. But my problem lies with the fact that we live in a gendered world, and it's simple things like men's deodorant and women's deodorant and a gents massage or ladies massage, just simple things like that. I don't see how a bathroom is going to change anything with something that's inevitable.
Thank you.
So this is for the opposition. I'm still not seeing any valid reason why bathrooms shouldn't be we mentioned this whole thing that there's a cultural idea behind bathrooms and you go there, but I don't see why at all we actually need bathrooms to be the space to socialize and feel something. As the proposition mentions, it's some cubicle sealed off system. I don't see why they're putting so much stock in it's a cultural place to socialize or something because it's been there. I just feel like it hasn't been addressed properly.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
This question to this side. She said something about accommodating everyone. So then my question is, what about those who don't feel comfortable about the idea? Aren't you supposed to accommodate them? And why do we have to make all of the toilet gender neutral? Why don't we do twice? Make gender neutral bathrooms and separate. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Barry.
So mine's not so much as a question, it's more like an idea. So, assuming that gender-neutral bathrooms, you don't need to build more than one bathroom, why is this not something that people like property developers are not endorsing more often? And why, considering it's so practical, if you're building a shopping mall, you only need to build one set of bathrooms instead of multiple. Is it such a prevalent thing in our society that people just can't absolutely stand this idea, and how do we overcome that? So, it's more praying for proposition. If this thing is such a prevalent thing in society that people will overlook the immediate, like, massive practical benefits of it, how do we overcome that, and how do we change it so people can accept this?
Okay, thank you very much.
So, I think against the opposition, I think Jordan touched on these questions, but you kind of just like glossed over it. So, basically, you guys are justifying why we should sometimes have gender separate bathrooms. I've got two reasons for it. One is that people get harassed and comfortable, right? And therefore, they want to go to the one place that they can feel comfortable, right? The same thing happens with racism, right? People are also, like, objectively, like, actively talked down to and stuff racially, right? That happens all the time, right? They don't have a safe space to go to, right? It's a problem we need to solve. It doesn't mean we then segregate races, right? So again, simply saying that you get harassed doesn't seem like justification, right? The second thing that was sort of said is that the reason why gender is different to race is the fact that people get exposed and they get naked and it's more vulnerable, right? On this, I've got two things that I just can't comprehend it, right? One is that if you have a separate cubicle where you're not exposing yourself to anyone else, I don't see why it should be an issue. But second of all, some males also feel uncomfortable to have to expose themselves at urinals near other men. It's not necessarily like a gender thing, right? You still feel vulnerable, but you still have to go to the bathroom, right? If you have a separate cubicle, that shouldn't be an issue, whether it's exposing yourself to another male or a female because you've got your separate space. I still don't understand why specifically this is relevant for gender like separation.
Us living in a gendered world and deodorants and it's exactly why I believe unisex toilets should be there, because first of all, they don't change anything about whether you're a male or female, but because of the psychological impact that I explained in my speech, how it oppresses a significant number of people that already have a lot to face, considering how they always have to fight for their place in the world, how beyond the bathroom situation, they still have more things to deal with, and how having unisex toilets accommodates them. And essentially, the other point that I'm trying to make is that gender-neutral toilets are not for transgender people or people that don't identify with any gender. Gender-neutral toilets are for everyone. And we all have to give up something to use them, because I would also love toilets for transgender people on campus. Because when I'm in the toilet, I also want to be with other transgender people that understand where I'm coming from. But what I'm saying is that I'm arguing for a position of compromise here. And yes, it does involve females and males and other people making sacrifices, but it's the solution which will carry us forward as a nation. And and that addresses the question of having gender neutral and gender toilets as well. I think it's like whenever you have we compartmentalize these issues, you always give prevalence to females and males over the minority. So I think that the blanket solution here is to come up with a solution which accommodates everyone to prevent any differences that might come up. Why aren't people supporting this? I think generally people don't support it. People will never support such an initiative because we live in a world where you either use a male or a female toilet, and I certainly don't expect all the malls all the toilets in a mall to be gender neutral, but I expect all the toilets at UCT where people come here to learn about life to be gender neutral, so that in the future a mall can be built which accommodates everyone and which essentially has gender neutral toilets. So UCT is the starting point, and we need to remember UCT's place in order to rationalize why toilets should be unisex. Thank you.
So I'll jump right in. Firstly, to deal with this issue of bathrooms shouldn't be a place to socialize, I don't think that was our point. Our point was that we live in a world where there is a definite culture of patriarchy, a definite culture of misogyny. And for as long as we can go to the UCT confessions page and see that people are reporting instances of rape anonymously, of people who break them and they see on campus, we live in a South African context where the idea of corrective rape is something that many feel is valid. You cannot then ignore or expect people to be able to live in an environment like that and not feel fearful within the context where they have no choice of safety, in a particularly vulnerable position to be in a particularly enclosed space. So for that reason, I think that what we are saying is that you are not fully addressing the many people who are also valid, the many people whose need for protection is just as valid as trans people. And in that case, we should accommodate their space and their need for security, or even in the very perception thereof in navigating their school careers, right? So secondly, to deal with the issue of racism. What we feel is that there are some instances where separation is fundamentally legitimate, right? And if we take into consideration the fact that we do live in a gendered society, if we lived in a perfect society where gender didn't exist and there weren't imbalances, then fine and fair enough, we would allow that, right? But the distinction between racism and these kinds of bathrooms is that nobody is actually being actively excluded or discriminated against. No one is being subject to a system of disadvantage or lower quality facilities. Nobody is actually being dehumanized. People are being given freedom of choice. People are being given the ability to express themselves in whatever way they manifested. So the capacity for society to change is also an issue, right, in this debate in terms of comparing it to racism and gender, aside from the point that it isn't a dehumanizing experience to have to choose. But we think that the gender binary is something that is far more entrenched into our society than racism ever was. That the gender binary is something that so many of us, as educated as we are, still subscribe to subconsciously today. And that if we are to do the work of undoing all of that, it definitely doesn't mean forcing people. It definitely doesn't mean doing the last bits, which is changing labels in toilets. It has more to do with society and its progression in a way that doesn't mean that we become radical in a way that is oppressive of trans people and people who want to use these bathrooms. Thank you.
This policy is for a woman who dresses like a man, identifies as a woman, and would be degendered by a policy which would exclude her from identifying as a woman by the bathroom she chooses. It's because the gender binary is far more endemic than we give it credit for. It's because if you don't conform to the gender binary, you're automatically transgendered. That's equally problematic. It's that no matter who we are and how we act, that we should not be gendered by the public spaces that we interact with is the policy that validates us as a proposition. And even why they have a minority compromise, that we have one gendered bathroom, that perpetuates the exclusion for people. Because if they don't opt into a cisgendered normative area, then they immediately opt out and are shunned. Especially in a context in where the fight against oppression was never held back by how we interrelate with our oppressors, that we just didn't fear the backlash of racists was never a sufficient reason for us to not keep fighting and not keep taking progressive steps in order to effecting change. So let's deal with two ideas of how are we kept safe and how are we gendered. The first is that the policy we instituted about safety was of trying to institute single cubicle bathrooms that are gender neutral, so you wouldn't have to in the first place, interact with people or be obliged to do so. But more than that, we think it's particularly disingenuous to characterize bathrooms as a safe space for women in a context in which they are oppressed. It's arbitrary. There are no cameras, no security, and the only barrier to women being violated in a bathroom is social convention. We think it's perpetuating a very pernicious lie to suggest that women are safe in bathrooms just because they are women. And we think that that's something that needs to be worked on by social progress, to create safer environments for women rather than teach them that bathrooms are the safe places for them. The solution to their problem is social change, not bathrooms. But second, we think it creates an arbitrary gender imposition that your aggressor and the person who violated you has to be the person of an opposite gender to you, that only women are raped by men and women can never be raped by other women. It's that pernicious understanding of gender that's carried through by their case. It's probably why not many people report being raped by a person of the same gender as them. It's because we create that mutual antagonism by the very segregation of bathrooms in the first place. We think a progressive step in that context for rape victims isn't in creating bathrooms as a safe space, but to addressing the core issue behind it. And we think we do that with inclusion as a first step. They tell us that how we make this particularly safe from Jordan is that other gendered people will experiment with these bathrooms and that's how they'll be made safe, because we won't be able to target people. It's extremely telling that the only way trans people can be protected is if other cisgendered people buy into their understanding of gender, that the only way they are protected is other people intrinsically support them. We think that's dangerous, that they can't be protected for being trans people themselves. And if people wanted to experiment to be bathroom hipsters, we don't think that's a significant enough barrier to protecting them. We don't think safety is the primary measure of a bathroom, and even if it was, we don't think that you achieve that. In the process of being gendered, we tell you that what they've told us on two levels is that sex is an arbitrary determinant, and that we'd like to attack a culture of continued oppression against transgendered individuals, but they're perfectly willing to continue to perpetuate the significant divide by otherizing people, as we've horribly done with disabled people by suggesting that they're other and that no one else can use their bathrooms because they are different. It's that sort of fetishizing the aspect of disability. But what we tell you is that bathrooms themselves ought never to be a gendered space, because the activity associated with them isn't a gendered activity. You go there to excrete. It's not something that is particularly tied to who you are as a gendered individual, but to your humanity. But second, we think for the people who are cisgendered who would be extremely discomforted by this, it's that we must perpetuate the standpoint that you are not validated by the bathroom you choose. It's that understanding which is oppressive. It's that for people who are hypermasculinized, choosing that bathroom and being validated by it as something they need. We don't think it's a necessity to be validated by your bathroom. We think you can be validated by things that are in your control, like your choice to be hypermasculine. We think that all that they do by suggesting that we would piss off some cisgendered people is that we consolidate sexuality as a significant determinant of gender, and that's something that we need to take progressive steps away from. Just because you have a particular type of genitalia obviously doesn't mean you opt into a gender, but that's how bathrooms are traditionally segregated, and that's something that will be perpetuated even when there's just one gender-neutral bathroom. But for transgendered people, the people who have surprisingly received very little airtime in this debate, it's that they are otherized by a context in which they can never opt into a gender based on who they are, and we continue to perpetuate specific ideals to be associated with your gender, and we think that's problematic. Just because you don't look like a woman doesn't mean you can't use a woman's toilet, and if we can't allow that in society, you shouldn't be validated or when you choose to opt out of that. That's the process. It's that why must we commit ourselves to a gender whenever we use a bathroom? And that's worse for cisgendered people equally when we're told that we have to engage with that and commit our gender every time we decide to excrete. We take the progressive step to change. We take the progressive step to protecting the oppressed. Thank you.
What I'm going to start by talking about in my speech are problems that none of us solve in this debate, that neither proposition or opposition solves, and that's something that I'm very saddened by, but I don't think that it's any reason to side with any of the teams. And I think what Yash does in his speech is he points out these problems, and he tries to delude you and show you that their side, in fact, helps these problems and solves them, right? So the first problem we get, the first problem that we have, is that people who self-identify as perhaps being a male but wanting to use a female bathroom, and that's the way that they see their identity and that's the way they see their gender, those people aren't going to be helped in either way by any of these policies. The problem is, even if we have gender-neutral bathrooms, if you self-identify as a female while you are a male, you can't actively choose to use a female bathroom either, right? You're forced to use a gender-neutral bathroom, and so your gender identity still isn't helped and your gender identity still isn't aided. And so we don't think that any of the sides in this debate can really address that problem, can really help those sorts of people. So what we tell you from our side, from opposition, is that we're trying to protect the most people in this debate. We're trying to not make this a homogeneous case in which everybody is forced to use the same bathroom, and so that some people who are male and who self-identify as being male can still use the bathrooms in which they feel comfortable in, right? We're trying to solve the problem for the most people and still help those people. Furthermore, Yash comes up and he tells you that it's just bathrooms aren't the way for, like, bathrooms are just there to go and excrete, and it's not a gender-based activity. But the entire debate, what we've told you and what we've heard from the audience themselves, is that, in fact, people perceive it to be a particularly gender-based activity. And that isn't something that's just going to change in society, and that isn't something that's just going to suddenly radically change if UCT decides to change its policy, right? I'm going to talk about this a little later, but particularly the way that this is the wrong place to make the change. If for 18 years of your life as a citizen in South Africa, you're being exposed to cultures and you're being exposed to gender normal ideas, when you get to UCT, having gender neutral bathrooms here doesn't address that problem. Instead, it uses these kinds of people as a scapegoat to try and solve this problem when we don't get any real change, and we think that's really harmful, and that isn't something that you should force people to do, right? So I just want you to experience this thought experiment I'm going to describe. Imagine a world in which everyone is already gender neutral and all bathrooms are gender neutral, right? And you so happen to be born a male, and you self-identify as being a male. It would be preferable for you to be able to use a bathroom for male people, right? That's what you self-identify as, that's what you find value in. So we think rather offer as many people as many bathrooms as possible, and that's the way you get the most protection, that's the way you get the most comfort, and that's the way you help most people. That's what we're arguing for. Homogeneity is bad in this case because the more bathrooms that are available, the better it is for everyone. In terms of the next question that comes up after this, in terms of whether or not this is similar to racism, we say that it's not on a number of different levels. Firstly, we tell you that particularly using different bathrooms in the racial context was used as a tool of oppression, was used as a worse quality bathroom to oppress people further. But what we say is the most important distinction is in the racial context, you couldn't use a bathroom that belonged to white people if you were black. What we tell you here is if you're a transgender person, you can use a gender neutral bathroom, or you can use the bathroom, another gendered bathroom. In both cases, you can use either of those bathrooms, and there's no strict and solid distinction, right? But the last and most important reason we tell you it's different is just the ability for society to change, right? Based in that context under apartheid, to have a racial bathroom, we think is incongruent with what the majority of the country wants. We don't think the majority of the country wanted to have racial bathrooms. We don't think currently people want racial bathrooms. If somebody tried to implement one, we think that would be really, really horrible. From Julian's start of his speech, we made it very clear that we're very sad, that this is the way South Africa is, and this is the context, and that we don't believe there is this idea of like gender absolutism. But that's just the way that people see it, right? So why isn't this something that's likely to change? We think as children, you can't implement gender-neutral bathrooms because of the awkwardness that comes about it, because of boys and girls who are teenagers going through puberty and experiencing those sorts of things share bathrooms. That's going to be particularly problematic. We think as well, even if UCT implements the policy, as was pointed out, if we have bathrooms in malls, bathrooms in other places, right? Other situations not even related to bathrooms that continuously enforce these stereotypes, that it isn't going to change. What we tell you is the only reason in which you should have a change like this, in which you can break down these stereotypes, that would be the only reason to implement a policy like that, but that just isn't the case, and we've never heard any reasons why people will change their minds and will change their opinions. Furthermore, we heard from Fazeka about how this in fact radicalizes people. It makes people unhappy if they're forced to use gender-neutral bathrooms, if it is something that's important to them. And so we're even more less likely to get the kind of breaking down of social norms and gender identities that this side of the House wants. So because we actually want a better world for South Africa, want a non-gender idealized society, and we're very saddened that we can't have one, but we protect the most people, that's why you should side with side opposition in this debate.
Thank you for the third speakers of both sides. I now once again and for the final time open the floor for questions.
Yeah, that's the first question, please. You speak a lot about how if you're very masculine and you're a male and you identify as being a male, you won't feel particularly comfortable going to a gender-neutral bathroom, and that's the people you're trying to protect. But surely if you're so hyper-masculine or hyper-feminine, you should be comfortable enough in your sexuality to be able to use a gender-neutral toilet and not feel any type of way about that.
Right, Farron.
So, Slims, you talk about having bathrooms for every single person, or as many people as possible. You didn't say everyone, but is that not impractical? Because I mean, the moment you start breaking it down further and further from the gender binary, so you're going to have gender-neutral bathrooms, but then you may also have to have bathrooms for this type of certain subgroup of this subcategory. And where do you draw the line? Where do you stop? How do you determine who is important to have a bathroom for yourself and who isn't important? So I think there's no ways you can actually justify saying, well, we're going to give bathrooms to this group, this group, this group, and this group, but all the other groups you're not important enough, so we're not going to give it to you. How do you justify that? How do you rationalize that?
Right, thank you, Julie.
Yeah, ultimately I see the debate as a practicality issue if you sort of want to just ignore the gender issue. In a public place like a mall, they need to optimize the infrastructure to deal with the high input But it's impractical at UCT where we have like Leslie, which is a maze as it is, to find a bathroom. So ultimately it's a practicality issue. I think the community, regardless of gender constructs, is best served by actually creating bathrooms that everybody can use, because that means that you don't have to like walk 20 more meters to get to a bathroom when you're desperate.
Okay, so like, I think the reason like we even put up the racial issue is because it's just sort of as arbitrary as gender in this case, in the sense that we all urinate, we all defecate, it doesn't matter what gender you are, it doesn't matter what race you are, it's the same thing, right? We all do the same thing and have the same needs. So that's why like I keep bringing it up, because I feel like in the South African context it seems to be a more sensitive like aspect, right? So the reason we got from opposition was the fact that no, but it was different, those were a form of oppression, right? So apparently the standards of the bathroom are the same, but we still have racially separate bathrooms, that would be fine because it wouldn't be oppressive. But then they say, no, the problem with the racial segregation is not just the standard, it's the fact that if you are black, you could not use a white bathroom, right? And vice versa. So basically, if I am female, I apparently am allowed to use a male bathroom, but if that's the case, that is arguing for gender neutrality, right? The minute I'm told I can't use that bathroom even though I need to go to the bathroom because I'm a female and this is a male bathroom, and if I go in there, I get even more harassed simply for having the need to go to the bathroom, right? That is the exact same problem. I'm excluded from that area and told I can't satisfy a basic need I have because I don't fit a specific gender, right? And that's why we kind of like reiterating this sort of like concern, right? So its idea is that like, even if you identify, like the argument is that if you identify as male, you should be able to identify as that. I identify as being both white and Romanian. I don't have white Romanian female bathrooms on campus. I can't go to those bathrooms, right? So like, you can't simply make something catering for every single group. That's why you have neutrality of sexual orientation, race, gender. That's why we're arguing for neutrality, is because you can't cater for a separate bathroom for every single group, for everything they identify with. And simply identifying with your gender is problematic in itself. Please deal with that issue.
This is just making a comment at the prompt. Less of a question, more just an observation. It's a bit dangerous to suggest that like you can opt into a gender. It's definitely, well, not definitely, but it's not so much a choice. You can opt into how you choose to express your gender, and that's fine. But it's dangerous to suggest you can opt into something like universal gender experience without exhibiting some form of sexism.
Okay, thank you.
Just have one question for proposition. When you said you want to divide things up into cubicles, would you have the urinals in like a public place where a woman would have to walk past them in order to get to the bathrooms, or would you have them separate as well? So I mean, are you within the gender-neutral bathrooms? Are you going to segregate things with cubicles? I mean, or are you going to keep the urinals public, but the cubicles outside?
Okay, are those all the questions? All right, I now offer the floor to both of the speakers to answer the questions.
So we can choose to express our gender through our choices. So we can choose to wear particular things in order to express how feminine we are. We can choose not to wear particular things to express how masculine we are. But the problem we have is that a bathroom, a place you go to excrete, a public area within a university that should be shared by everyone, shouldn't be a tool for you to gender yourself. And we think that's particularly problematic. That it ought not be the space to validate your gender for anyone, and that you ought not be able to express that just by going into the bathroom you do. So it's not that, like a conception from the opposition is that we are degendering people who are cisnormative if they don't opt in, if they opt into a gender-neutral bathroom. And we think that conception itself is problematic. Just because you opt into a gender-neutral bathroom does not mean you have no gender. It means that you are of a varying type of gender. And we think that that articulation is particularly important. It's that problematic conception of gender as being something that you are gendered by when you go into a bathroom is what we're trying to fight against. And we think that's liberating for both cisgender and transgender people. So cisgender people don't have to declare how masculine they are every time they walk into a bathroom equally. So the two questions we do have is, what is our policy specifically on urinals? And yeah, they're probably going to be segregated as well, so that everything is private. Ideally, our policy was to have single bathrooms that were gender neutral that one person can enter into at a time. We think that's the best form of gender neutrality. But even internally, logistically, we can segregate those, and we think that that creates the same environment. So effectively what we're standing for is that you should never be forced to validate yourself in terms of gender by a public construct. And we think that's equally as oppressive to both us as men and women who identify as that and transgendered people who don't. Our measure of our masculinity, femininity, or something in between is never validated by what we are forced and obliged to do for an arbitrary function. And that's the base premise that we have from the proposition. So I don't really have anything else to respond to, but at this point, we've given you 3 ideas. We've given you that this benefits cisgendered people because we don't ever have to commit and validate ourselves by a gendered yardstick. We validate trans people by giving them the opportunity not to be directly oppressed. And that's the context in which I think opposition misses. We're not trying to solve the gender issue on a social level. We're trying to make things a little bit better for the students at this university. And we think that that's the progressive step we need when we are a gateway to the rest of society. Because the rest of society is untransformed isn't a reason for us to hold ourselves back from the progression that we think is valuable. Thank you.
I was trying to make this point is that if you imagine a religious person, and particularly a Christian person, using a facility, they would much rather choose to use a Christian facility than an a-religious facility, right? So the point that I was making here is if you make all bathrooms gender neutral, you don't allow people who do strongly self-identify as a particular gender to get that satisfaction and happiness of having that affirmed by using something that is in line with their gender identity. And that's something that neither of these sides, that isn't a problem that any of these policies effectively change, and that isn't something that should come into your consideration of whether or not we want all bathrooms in UCT to be gender neutral or not, right? In terms of the practicalities, we tell you that practically we have to have large bathrooms on campus, that it's unlikely that if we have single cubicles for every single person to deal with the load of people and the number of people, that that's going to work. So what we think the best thing is, and the most practical thing is to have large bathrooms, but to have them separated under 3 main categories. And yes, it's difficult to say, look, there's a bunch of other people who belong to categories that aren't included here, but we would rather try and be as inclusive as possible, instead of just making them all gender neutral and homogeneous and not allowing certain people who think that these other bathrooms are important and take away access from those people, right? So the last thing I want to talk about is just, again, this idea of race-based bathrooms and whether it's the same or not as this. And I think that the response here, right, you picked out 2 of the responses that we had, but I don't think you pick out the last response. And what I would ask is for you to consider this debate in its entirety and not just this one single issue. We do think it would be a lot better for those people if they could just choose, yes, every single bathroom is gender neutral. But the question is what effect this has on UCT as a campus in and of itself and all of the people on this campus, right? So if it is better for this person to be able to use any bathroom, any single gender neutral bathroom, if what that means is it leads to more people on campus becoming radicalized, if it leads to more people on campus being unlikely to accept gender neutral ideas in all of their entirety, if it leads to more problems for this cause and it leads to more people categorizing gender stereotypes and being unlikely to accept these people in society, we think that that's problematic and we think that that's harmful. So yes, it would be better, but we think that the other implications and the other influences and the context particularly of this debate and where this is going to be taking place mean that it isn't something that we should force on people and it isn't something that we should change because it doesn't lead to the kind of situation that we all want and that we all think would be best for everyone. So if you do want to do what's better for students on UCT, if you do want to help people on campus, the arguments that we've told you about how this leads to actually it being a worse situation because it changes not only what happens in bathrooms, but what happens in all of the contexts and outside of bathrooms as well. If you want to protect those people, then you should side with opposition.